So welcome. My name is Chris Adams. I'm Director of Training for the National Press Foundation, a journalism training organization based in Washington. Today we have a coronavirus-related webinar briefing. We have two experts from the University of Maryland's Center for Vaccine Development and Global Health. We're going to talk about the vaccine development process in general, and also how it relates specifically to COVID-19. Like all of you out there, we are all working from our homes today. I normally would be coming to you from the Evelyn Y. Davis studios in downtown Washington, where we normally do our webinars. Today we're at home, but I do have a coffee mug from the Evelyn Y. Davis studios. So I just want to be sure to mention Evelyn Y. Davis, who has funded our studio in downtown Washington. Who I have with us today are Dr. Wilbur Chen and Dr. Kathleen Newsel of the Center for Vaccine Development and Health. As I said, they're going to talk about the development process in general and then very specifically. They're not going to talk, the introductory remarks are going to be relatively short. We see this mostly as a Q&A session for all of you out there. We had 200 registrants. I can see a majority of you are online now. And so we should have lots of time. We should have lots of questions and lots of time for questions. While I wait for a few more people to get signed on, I just want to tell you about some of our other upcoming programs. Like everybody else, we have transitioned from our in-person NPF trainings for journalists to online trainings. We have a 3-webinar series on homelessness and COVID-19. We did our first one of those last Monday. We have our second one on Monday the 6th, 3 days from now, talking with experts on the front lines of homelessness who are dealing with and doing outreach to the homeless community. Included in that webinar, which will be noon on Monday, will be Dennis Culhane from the University of Pennsylvania, who has done some of the best research on the estimates for homelessness, quarantine, and bed needs, and also Stephanie Klasky-Gamer from the LA Family Housing Agency. A week after that, on Monday, April 13th, we will have a homelessness and COVID-19 webinar on the eviction process and how the homelessness situation will change in coming months. Included in that webinar or briefing will be Matthew Desmond of Princeton University, the author of the Pulitzer Prize winning book Evicted. We'll be talking about the eviction process, and others talking about how the face of homelessness will be changing in the coming months. We will be doing webinars on a range of issues, mostly obviously COVID-19 related, in coming weeks when we are able to get back to our in-person trainings. We're not sure when, hopefully in the summer, maybe later. We'll be doing a mix of in-person trainings like we always have done and the online versions. So with that, I want to give a brief introduction to our two guests. Dr. Chen will go first. He's an adult infectious disease physician and scientist with a specific interest in clinical vaccinology. He's chief of the Adult Clinical Studies section at the Center for Vaccine Development and Global Health at the University of Maryland Medical School in Baltimore. Dr. Kathleen Newsel is the director of the center. She's a leading global research leader on vaccine development and policy. And she has, during her career, she's been instrumental in the introductions of rotavirus, HPV, and other vaccines. She works with a consortium of other vaccine development academic centers, and she'll be able to talk about that. So I want to start with Dr. Chen. Dr. Chen, thank you for joining us today, and I was hoping you could give us a little bit of a background of the Center for Vaccine Development and a brief tutorial on the vaccine development process.
Sure. So
turn it over to you.
You started out with swag and showing, so I'll just show my cup here for the Center for Vaccine Development. Thank you, Chris, for inviting us to talk today. So let me just give you a brief context for the Center for Vaccine Development, just to say why we are so passionate about vaccine development. So we've been in existence for more than 40 years. And we've always concentrated on developing vaccines against emerging infections, against pathogens that afflict developing country settings and impoverished and vulnerable populations. So, you know, we were at the head of vaccine development for avian influenza, for 2009 pandemic influenza, for Ebola and Zika, just to kind of give you an idea of what the CVD kind of does. And we do it from soup to nuts, so that means benchtop work all the way through clinical trials, epidemiology, burden of disease, and policy as well. So in-house, we are a large center, and we do a lot of different things. So Kathy and I are just representatives. Kathy is, of course, the director and oversees all of this activity, and I just am a minor part of it. So that's the CVD. Vaccine development, let me just briefly say that vaccine development pipelines and timelines are typically on the order of 10 years to 15 years. When we have a pandemic, we try to truncate everything. In the case of Ebola, we had clinical trials that went into clinical trials very quickly. In this instance, even more quickly. And this was very dramatic that we were able to have the first COVID-19 vaccine into clinical trials within just a couple of months of recognition of this pathogen. So pretty incredible, and Kathy will talk about that more and about other therapeutics. Just to talk about the timeline. So typically we have to do a phase 1, a phase 2, a phase 3, or a series of phase 3s for the FDA to license a vaccine. And that's assuming that through all of these stages or phases that the vaccine is successful, doesn't prove to be reactogenic or have any safety features, that it doesn't prove to have the immune responses that we desire, you know, those features of a vaccine that are crucial. So that's really what we think about normally. And normally a phase 1 study is on the order of about 6 months. And a phase 2 study might be 6 to 12 months, and a phase 3 study might be a year or 2 or 3. And so even when you have a vaccine that is successful through all of those gates, the traditional timeline is going to be doing phase 1, then a phase 2, then a series of phase 3s, or maybe a series of phase 2s and phase 3s. And again, it adds up to about a decade for a successful vaccine. So when we talk about a truncated timeline, and we're thinking about trying to have a vaccine that's licensable in about 18 months, that's a really tremendous feat. It's achievable, and I think that it's reasonable. We have to assume that it's going to be successful through all of these different stage gates. So that's kind of the general overview. I didn't want to waste too much of the time in talking about the context of this entire discussion today, because I wanted it to be for Q&A, which I think is going to be the most valuable part. So I'm going to hand off to Kathy now and let her talk about some of the other things that she thinks are going to be necessary for.
Okay, and Dr. Newsel, before you get started, I just want to give all of our viewers and listeners a heads up on the Q&A session. You should be able to raise your hands, and if you raise your hands and we call on you, then we will activate your mic and you'll be able to ask your question via audio, or you can answer questions by typing in the questions, and I'll be conveying those questions to the two speakers. So you can raise your hand and do it audio and wait for us to call on you, or you can type them in, and everybody else should be able to see all the other questions coming in. You can upvote them if they're ones that you want to make sure get answered. So as Dr. Newsel talks, I'll be expecting to see some of your hands going up and your questions coming in, and then we'll turn to the Q&A. So Dr. Newsel?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Wilbur, for that really perfect introduction. So now we're at the point where we're trying to accelerate the development and hopefully the use of a vaccine against COVID-19. And there is a vaccine that's being tested in China, and then as Wilbur said, there's a single vaccine right now in clinical testing, so with human participants in the United States, and we hope that there will be more, and ideally many more in the coming months. So this vaccine that is currently in trials was a result of a consortium of NIAID, so the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. We like to use a lot of acronyms in our business, but that's the NIH Institute that is directed by Dr. Tony Fauci, who many of you have seen on the news. And as part of that institute, there's an infectious diseases clinical research consortium. And this consortium consists of a leadership group with experts in clinical medicine and laboratory medicine. It consists of 9 vaccine and treatment evaluation units across the country who have expertise, who are poised to test vaccines against any number of pathogens, and particularly are poised to surge that capacity and jump in a time such as this when we have a public health emergency. We're working with the biotechnology company Moderna and the Vaccine Research Center, who together developed this initial vaccine. You know, people will ask me, how did this vaccine get into trials so quickly? And please be assured that there was no compromise, and there is never any compromise on safety and on the processes that we follow for vaccine development. So this went through full FDA review, full ethical review in multiple centers. The reason we were able to get into trials so quickly is because this vaccine was modeled on other vaccines for influenza, for Zika, using the same manufacturing process, using the same technology, but just substituting the genetic code for this SARS-CoV-2 virus and the particular spike glycoprotein that our body first sees when we're affected with this virus to make this vaccine. So this is not a live virus vaccine. It cannot cause COVID-19, and again, was able to go into clinical trials so quickly because we have experience with this platform and this type of vaccine. Of course, these participants are being followed extremely carefully at 2 centers right now, one at Kaiser Permanente in Seattle and the other at Emory University in Atlanta.
Okay, so we have some questions coming in, and we have Dennis Thompson has his hand raised, and I think if we give him audio control, so you can, Dennis, you should be able to ask your question.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
We can hear you, yes.
Thank you for the question. Y'all are emphasizing safety. I guess just to give this some context, what are some concerns about what could go wrong with this expedited process if a vaccine gets to market that isn't perfectly safe? What could happen to people who take the vaccine?
Do you want me to take that? Or
You can start, go ahead.
Well, the first thought that comes to mind is we're doing these clinical trials and there are limited numbers of people. So there always is the chance that that a rare event that we can't detect with a very small population of people being tested may come about when we license a vaccine and give it to a larger population. So again, if it's a rare event that only happens 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000, but it is associated with the vaccine, then that could be something that, again, we would not know about. That would be a safety feature about that vaccine. Again, it would have to be a trade-off between whatever that adverse effect was and the true protection that we would be able to find with a vaccine. So again, we would want to balance out the benefit of the vaccine, which is hopefully saving lives, and that adverse event, whatever it was. But again, we may not find these adverse events because they're pretty rare.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to add to that, for this specific vaccine, again, we made it into phase 1 quickly. We start with healthy young and middle-aged adults. We follow them very carefully. We have checkpoints along the way where groups assess the data that we've gathered. Then we move to phase 2, as Dr. Chen described earlier, where we go to hundreds, and then we may go to thousands. And you know, as Dr. Chen said, it's a risk-benefit equation, and we know we are in the middle of a pandemic right now. And so again, we are very carefully following safety, but we really can't forget that, you know, we're now above the 1 million mark for people infected with COVID-19.
Thank you.
Okay. So we have a question. This is kind of a basic tutorial question I think will be helpful. Dr. Chen, this is from Deanne Schaffhauser. Dr. Chen, can you describe what kinds of things take place in each of those 3 phases?
So it's a stepwise evaluation of a product. The first phase is primarily focused on safety and whether or not there are any reactions that we can detect. It's a small sample size, which means that it's usually on the order of, say, 50 or maybe 100 people, but it's a small number of people. And here we're only able to look at major reactions and non-rare or common reactions. Built into that are lab tests so that we can look to see if there's anemia or anything that affects the liver or the kidney or some other things as well. So we do lab testing as well as evaluating very closely symptomatology for someone who received the vaccine. So we actually give what's called a diary card or a memory aid for the 7 days after they get vaccinated to be able to record very carefully whatever reactions they might have. And so if it's a vaccine by needle and syringe, we actually ask them to use a ruler to measure if there's redness, swelling, or anything else. And they actually measure that size in millimeters, record that on a daily basis. That's kind of the level of scrutiny that we use to try to evaluate that so-called safety. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is really similar. We continue that, except that we expand it to hundreds of people at that point. And in addition to that, then we also look at the immune response. So in phase 1, we look at the immune response as well, but that's not the most important feature. It's the safety that we concentrate on. Phase 2, then we start looking at the immune response because we're now assured that the common reactions we've probably already assessed pretty well in phase 1, but we continue to assess that, and it's a cumulative kind of data set for the phase 2. So it's both safety and immune response. And then for phase 3, we continue to look at safety, again, because we're increasing the sample size. We're now looking at more rarer adverse effects, but not the most rare. And again, immune response really rises to the priority where we're looking at those immune responses, which is predictive of how efficacious that vaccine will be. That's how we predict how well the vaccine will perform. And it's traditionally, we have to draw blood and look at those antibodies or something else as part of the immune response that the body mounts in response to that vaccine.
Okay. So some another written questions in from Jess Burns from Oregon Public Broadcasting. What's the expected success rate for vaccines making it through the 3 stages of human testing?
Kathy, you want to?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. I would put it as low. I mean, it's certainly somewhere less than 5 or 10%. Again, there are a lot of vaccines that make it into phase 1, and it's usually not safety that knocks them out. It's usually that, you know, they don't produce a good immune response, or perhaps they practically can't be made. You know, the manufacturing that would be required would just be too cumbersome to take them further. So there's a whole number of reasons why vaccines may not succeed, which is precisely why at the beginning I said that at this phase of a pandemic, we want as many different types of formulations. And again, we will go through the safety process. They will all be reviewed by the FDA. They will all be reviewed by the ethics committee. But you can't count on a single vaccine. We want a lot of shots on goal right now, hoping that we'll score with at least one of these.
You know, what I'll also add is that we may not have the perfect vaccine right out. You know, the first licensed vaccine might not be perfect, hopefully, as Kathy said, we'll have multiple different vaccines being evaluated, and that we'll have better vaccines coming online throughout this entire process. So I think, again, don't have the idea that once we have one vaccine, we're done. We want to continue to have a pipeline because we could have improved vaccines.
Okay. So next we're going to go to an audio question from Linda Liu, who is with the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. So it's midnight for you in Hong Kong. Linda, what's your question?
Hi, I would like to ask a question on collaborations between countries. So there's been a lot of talk of competition between countries to be the first to successfully develop a COVID-19 vaccine. There were reports of Trump, offering money to a German vaccine company, and China is getting its military involved, really pressing its researchers to fast-track development. So I was wondering, how do you see this competition impact your work? And would it be detrimental to collaboration across countries and organizations? Thank you.
So Wilbur, I can take a first stab at that. I'm involved at the global level with the World Health Organization and a committee called the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization. I'm involved at the national level as part of this IDCRC that I described, that's looking at bringing vaccines through our vaccine and treatment evaluation units. And I would say I have seen a high degree of collaboration. I certainly don't have the expertise to comment on the individual examples that you have cited. But for example, the reason in the United States that we were able to have a vaccine so quickly is because the sequence of the virus was shared by China. And we were able to take that sequence, and researchers and developers were able to make a vaccine. And so really, as we've seen, this is a global pandemic. It's going to affect everybody. It's not going to respect borders. And so the problem is global, and really the solution is going to take global collaboration.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you want me to add something, I'll just
Sure.
say that, I don't think any of the industry partners that have approached us have ever made it their intent that they would only release to the US. I think everybody has been thinking about a global market and a global need. So, that's kind of the perspective that I've seen.
Okay. So our next audio question is going to be from Virginia Gewin, G-E-W-I-N. Virginia, you can ask your question.
Hi, I'm just curious, how many vaccine clinical trials do you anticipate will get underway around the world in the next few months? Like, how many shots on goal are we talking about?
For the reasons that Dr. Chen explained, it's always difficult to predict exactly. I mentioned the World Health Organization and others here in the US are tracking that pipeline. If all goes well, we may have 5 or 6 constructs in clinical trial in the next 6 months. It could certainly be higher. But as I said, there are already 2 that I know of. There could be more in China that I'm unaware of. And there are a couple others getting very close.
Okay. So I have a text question here from Julie Anderson of the Omaha World Herald. If you get a vaccine that successfully makes it through trials, how long would it take to make millions of doses to get them to people?
Kathy, do you know?
Well, people may have seen a recent press release from J&J where they're talking about manufacturing at risk. So, this is why we were discussing before that we look at safety and immunogenicity, but there are many other feasibility factors with manufacturing. And again, during a pandemic, scale up is going to depend on the actual formulation that you have, these mRNA vaccines, which is one of the ones in testing, could theoretically be scaled faster than other types of vaccines. But I think that you will see cooperation and companies at risk, starting to make vaccines sooner than they ordinarily would, because it is a pandemic. So, under Wilbur's timelines, if you think that you're a company and you're making investments, you're going to stage gate, right? You're not going to want to put out a lot of money until you have some certainty that you've passed that first stage or that second stage. So we're in a scenario where a lot of these actions that would ordinarily be in sequence are in parallel. So I think you will see faster than under a normal circumstance, but it's going to depend on the vaccine construct and the capacity of the individual manufacturer. What we hope to see is tech transfer, that if we have something successful, one manufacturer would tech transfer that to other manufacturers around the world, and then we could have simultaneous manufacture of this vaccine.
Yep. That's what I would have said as well, is cholera vaccine actually is one of the ones where there was one single company that had this vaccine. They tech transferred it to a few others, and now we've got a series of companies that are actually making cholera vaccine, basically the same vaccine, through these tech transfer agreements. This is cholera. This is again, not a vaccine for developed countries, and again has always been an overlooked, neglected kind of disease. But if we use that kind of scenario for this, where all of us understand that we have to be in this together, I think that it will be feasible for companies, once we get a successful licensed vaccine, to that be transferred very quickly to other manufacturers, other industry sponsors, and for them in parallel to be making the vaccine as well. So we could have 5, 6, 10, 20 facilities simultaneously cranking out that same product once we have a successful vaccine. So hopefully we can get a global supply relatively quickly, quicker than what we traditionally are thinking about when we're developing vaccines. Okay.
So our next audio question is going to be from Annette Brindle, a senior editor at BioWorld. Annette, you can ask your question.
Thank you. So I have more of a big question about, big picture question about pandemic vaccine development. Since by definition we don't know what's going to show up until it's there, is it realistic to be developing sort of a series of broader spectrum vaccines like people are trying for the universal flu vaccine? And if that is a possibility, which viral families do you think would be important to go after?
Wilbur, you want to take a first?
I can take a stab, but I think Kathy, you serve on these working groups that are actually addressing this specifically. But for flu, the reason why we're excited about a universal flu vaccine is because there's this highly conserved area, theoretically, of the flu virus that could cover pandemic influenza, any type of pandemic influenza that might come along, compared to the seasonal influenzas. So it could actually serve those multiple purposes for future pandemics that are non-influenza, like this one, coronavirus, but even for Ebola, Hantan, Nipah, Hendra, all these other things, Ebola, Zika. The thing that got us off the ground with COVID-19 is because we had a platform technology vaccine in which you simply had to have the gene sequence. So, and we can do that within days and weeks now. So the platform technologies, to push those for future pandemic planning, is actually an essential part of us to be prepared for future pandemics. So that's why a lot of us in this kind of scientific discipline are very interested in platforms that can be broad-reaching for looking to the future.
Okay.
Yeah, and I agree completely with what everything Wilbur said. Our investments in pandemic preparedness have served us well. It's why we have been able to get this construct into clinical trials so quickly. To your point with influenza, we understand how frequently the strains change, and that's why we're working on a universal vaccine. We can't ignore that we've had now coronavirus outbreaks, 3 of them in the last about 20 years with SARS and MERS and now COVID-19. So it's entirely appropriate that this first vaccine development be focused on COVID-19. But we can't ignore the fact that coronaviruses may be here to stay. And so to think about a more pan-coronavirus vaccine makes a lot of sense as a future aspiration.
Okay. So next audio question from Emily Mullen of Medium. Emily, you can ask your question now.
Hi. Excuse me. Hi. Yes. I'm wondering, what do we know about immunity to this virus? So if a vaccine is successful at producing antibodies against it, how long do we think that immunity will last?
Do you want me to try, or?
Yeah, well, I can start with the simple answer, which is that we've only known about this virus for less than 4 months. So at this point, again, we're learning a lot every day. We need to understand with the people who are getting infected what their antibody response is showing, and then we need to continue to follow them, because it's going to be impossible to answer this question until we have some longer term data here, again, from either infected cohorts or from these early vaccine studies. Wilbur?
Yeah, I think the answer is we don't know, but we can look for hints with the seasonal human coronaviruses. There are 4 of them, and we know that infections with those, we think that there's waning immunity that for some of them only lasts for about 6 months to 12 months with those seasonal coronaviruses. As far as we understand, they're not a very well kind of studied virus, because most of the funding for respiratory viruses goes to influenza. But some studies have shown that there is what's called waning immunity. So you might have protection, but it's not very long lasting.
Okay. So we have a follow-up question from Linda Liu of the South China Morning Post. Do you expect the vaccine for COVID-19 to be effective for the long term, or could it be something like a flu shot, which we need to take each year?
Yeah, and I think that's a great follow-on to the question that we just heard. Again, I don't think we know right now. Certainly as part of these clinical trials, we're looking at immune responses in the near term, in a month after you get a vaccine, 2 months after you get a vaccine, because that's what is needed now. But we're also following these participants for a year or more, so that we can answer your exact question. How long does that immune response last? How good is that immune response? And will we need, it may not be yearly, it may be similar to some childhood vaccines where you need a booster dose every now and then. So again, I think these early cohorts that are these volunteers, who we owe a great deal of gratitude to these volunteers in these vaccine studies, we're going to learn a lot from these initial studies.
Okay, so for all of our listeners out there, as you've seen the questions coming in, there's a little thumbs up icon. If it's a question that you want to make sure we get answered during this session, upvote that, click on that, so I know which are the most popular questions out there. I want to go to an audio question from Susan Berger, a writer for the Washington Post and Chicago Tribune. Susan, you can ask your question.
There, can you hear me?
Now we can, yes.
Okay, so thanks for taking my question. I'm just really curious that, is there a way to guess how much the administration, getting rid of the pandemic response team, how did that really hinder the response? Would we be in a much better position if the pandemic response team, would they have been working all along on this? So have you lost a lot of time is the question.
Yeah, I think it's a very tough question. Again, I'm a scientist. I can't claim to know a lot of the political or governance answers. I would say from my scientific perspective, you know, pandemic preparedness has absolutely continued. I think just here at the University of Maryland, you know, we received a CIVIC, it's a collaborative influenza vaccine innovation center, which is a large initiative from NIH that went to 6 different centers to prepare scientifically for pandemic preparedness and for universal vaccines. So certainly at the level that I'm seeing, that pandemic preparedness and overarching governance has continued.
Okay. All right. So a text question from Natasha Dial. What catalyzes the start of a vaccine creation? That is, given we had SARS 2002 epidemic, why haven't we attempted a coronavirus earlier? Or if we had, what stalled it, and what stalled it, or has it been in process?
Wilbur, you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah. So these are kind of impeded areas where, again, the interest, the public interest and government interest, funding agencies are going to prioritize things that they see as important. And so since we can't predict these, by definition, they're things that appear off in the distance. They're difficult for us to convince funding agencies to continue to throw significant funds toward developing. That's why these broad platform technologies, we may purpose them now for influenza and very quickly be able to turn them on a dime to make them toward COVID-19. Kathy, you sit on CEPI, which also kind of serves the same purpose. But all of this is to say that we all understand that you know, funding and resources are limited. We want to use them in the best way. When there's not an outbreak, we don't want to always be crying wolf. So we want to use our abilities in a smart way. So we're trying to be ahead of the curve. And honestly, we do recognize that there are a lot of other viruses that are out there, hemorrhagic viruses, other even bacteria, that all have the potential either as a biothreat or as a future pandemic that we've all identified, but we can only do so much with the limited resources that we have on hand because in our everyday practices, we've already got a lot of other things that we're trying to tackle as well, such as shingles, such as pneumonia, those sorts of things that are everyday occurrences that we want to make sure that we address.
Okay. So we're going to go to an audio question from Catherine Child, who is from Business Day in South Africa. Catherine?
Hi, thanks for my question. I understand that you can make mRNA vaccines very quickly, but how quick can a safety trial be? So J&J, for example, said they're expecting to trial their vaccine in September. If successful, it'll be ready early 2021. I mean, can anyone do safety in 6 months? Do you know enough to roll out a vaccine after 6 months of safety testing?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. You know, when we have seen safety signals with vaccines, they ordinarily occur very soon after you give the vaccine. There are some exceptions to that, but most of the time you're going to see something that occurs soon after. Even in situations, you know, Guillain-Barré syndrome with the 76 swine influenza vaccine campaign, for example, you know, it's still within months afterward. And so again, that's where we expect the highest risk to be. Now, there is a theoretical concern that could come later, something called vaccine-enhanced illness that you may have seen a lot in the news. And that's when a vaccine, rather than preventing an illness, you know, paradoxically contributes to worse illness when you are exposed to that virus. You know, this has happened on rare occasions. In the rare occasions when it has happened, it's been in children, it's been with certain types of vaccines. So, you know, based on the available data with the current vaccine, with animal studies, Again, we're doing animal studies as well for these vaccines. You know, we don't believe this vaccine will increase the risk of severe illness, but you would like to follow these participants through at least an exposure to coronavirus. And again, if you're doing a vaccine trial now, they are being exposed to coronavirus. But, you know, sometimes we'll say a season or an exposure, you know, to be sure that you don't see this, again, extremely rare vaccine and enhanced illness phenomenon.
Okay. So next we have an audio question from John Lauerman of Bloomberg News. John, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for doing this. And I wanted to ask about the efficacy and durability of the immune response, but I think you answered a question on that already. It sounds like we don't really know what that is. But other vaccines have been developed against coronaviruses before, like SARS and MERS. They haven't gone through the approval process. But I'm wondering, what have we learned about these issues, safety, durability, efficacy, from earlier coronavirus vaccines? Thanks.
Well, those vaccines only went into early phase trials, never got very far. You know, again, because SARS, you know, in 2002 burned out by 2003. So again, we were never able to evaluate its efficacy. And then for MERS, we haven't seen an expansion of the illness outside of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. So I guess there hasn't been the global kind of urgency for developing vaccines against MERS either. So again, those vaccines have not progressed past those early phase trials. So the answer, I think, is that we never really got the opportunity to learn more because we didn't push them further. Here we have a commitment to push them because of the global health need right now, the pandemic spread of this. So I think we already know that we're going to go all the way as far as we can go to licensure. Whereas for those other two instances, it burned out or it just hasn't demonstrated the urgency that this virus has.
Okay. So next, audio question from Emily Bamforth of Cleveland.com. Emily, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi. So a common refrain that we've seen when it comes to vaccine development in the news is this could take as many as 12 to 18 months as a qualifier. Based on what we know now, what's a forecasted timeline for vaccine development to the best of your ability right now? Obviously, this depends on quite a few factors.
Yeah, I guess, you know, you've heard this before, but we hope for the best and we prepare for the worst. The reason that people are reluctant to make predictions is everything has to go well. You know, we're in a phase 1 right now. We have not seen any safety signals so far. We're very early, but you know that no safety issues. We have not even had a first look at the immune response, so we have no idea if you know these vaccines will or won't induce an immune response. So these things take time. This is a 2-dose vaccine schedule, so you need time to see the immunogenicity. Again, we're in 18 to 55-year-olds. We're going to need to expand that. We know that it's older people who are getting sick with this disease. So there are many steps along the way. We have accelerated this. I don't think anyone would have expected a phase 1 so soon. So it's possible to be less than a year, but that would really be an unprecedented situation where everything lines up exactly right.
Let me go to a text question from Dion Schaffhauser. If all goes well, you've mentioned 18 months for the compressed timeline to development of a successful vaccine. What's the timeline after that until the first large numbers of people get vaccines?
Yeah, so as we said, I mean, it could be less than 18 months. It could be closer to 12. Again, absolute best case scenario, maybe a little less than that. All of these steps have to happen in parallel. So we would hope, you know, if a manufacturer is seeing good results, that they would start to scale up now and manufacture at risk, so that very soon after we have the results of a study, you know, the FDA, of course, has to review and license this, which they can do in an accelerated manner, that that vaccine, you know, would already be manufactured and ready to ship and distribute. That's the scenario you would like to see. But again, it depends on, that has a risk-benefit ratio in itself. It depends on, you know, the cost of doing that. Nobody wants 1 billion doses of a vaccine sitting in their plant that turns out not to work and not to be licensed. So these are all risk-benefit ratios. But the idea here is that, first of all, with some public-private partnerships, perhaps, and other mechanisms would allow that manufacturing to start sooner than it otherwise might.
Yeah.
Okay.
And some of the timeline also depends on the complexity of how you have to make that vaccine. So for example, Shingrix, very popular vaccine, the demand outstripped the supply very quickly. The global supply just couldn't meet that demand. Again, we're going to have a global demand that, right at the outset, that we know that we have to try to meet. So that's why I think our earlier comments about tech transfer, having multiple facilities, multiple you know, industries making vaccines would be part of our calculation to try to meet a global, you know, global need.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes to go here, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. But it looks like Dawn Reese is unmuted. Dawn, can you hear me? And you can ask your question now.
I am. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
This is Dawn Rice. I'm a journalist in Chicago, and I have a two-part question. Since the vaccine trials are small batch, how many people are in the clinical trials? And then are there control studies? And if so, are you testing people that have autoimmune diseases as well as healthy people?
Yeah, so in this first trial in the US, which is the one I'm most familiar with, I do not know enough details personally on the one in China. There are 45 people, they're 18 to 55. And as we usually do with a phase 1, we start with healthy people. So, you know, we exclude people who have other chronic diseases or immune diseases until we understand more about the vaccine. And then as you move along in the different phases, you gradually relax those age restrictions, you gradually relax those exclusion criteria so you can include a more generalizable population. Wilbur, anything to add to that?
That's absolutely right. So we have to start with a very narrow, focused, healthy population, and then from there, what the purpose, part of the purpose of the phase 2 and 3 is to expand it out to these other parts of the population, which again, older adults, children, it can be nursing home populations, people with underlying conditions, which includes the autoimmune conditions that you mentioned as well. All of these traditionally represent their own either phase 2 or phase 3 studies. In this instance, we're probably going to try to combine these types of populations all together into a single types of trials so that we're not doing handfuls of different trials, but 1 or 2 major trials. But again, the focus has to be that we want to be able to feel comfortable that this vaccine will protect everybody in the population.
Okay. So let's go to another audio question from Frank Vinluan of Xconomy. Frank, you can go ahead and ask your question. We need to get Frank unmuted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Frank, yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay. But both of you emphasized that safety will not be compromised by the expedited timeline. But given that vaccine development typically takes up to a decade, can you learn enough about efficacy in a short amount of time? And what is lost in this truncated timeline, and how can you address that?
Yeah, so I'll start with that. Again, a lot of the reasons for the timelines that you ordinarily see are calculated stage investments. So, you know, we don't know if a vaccine is going to work or not. We follow a business model, and, you know, we do a small trial, we stop, we take a look at everything before we make an investment in a larger trial. So in this example, part of the acceleration is, again, not having that staged approach regardless of safety, but it's a staged resource approach that, you know, you're willing to spend some money, you're willing to move forward in parallel and make vaccine now for your phase 2, and that phase 2 may not go through, and you realize you've spent money on that vaccine that you will never recover. But in a pandemic, that's how you're going to do it. The other issue is we won't know long-term immunogenicity or efficacy. You're absolutely right. You know, maybe we'll have a vaccine that protects for 6 months. We don't know. But right now, a vaccine that protects for 6 months would be an absolute game changer. And then we would find out over time if it protects for a year or 2 years or 3 years. So many of these studies start from the beginning saying, we're going to have a 3 or 4 year study, right? Because we don't want to be giving the population a new vaccine every 6 or 12 months. But when you're in the middle of a pandemic, you are happy to settle for 6 months of protection. Or as Wilbur said, you know, the influenza vaccine gets a bad rap. You know, we hear sometimes it's 50% effective and everybody says, oh, you know, why can't it be 90%? So, you know, with the coronavirus vaccine, we would be thrilled if we could be preventing half of these infections. I mean, look at the situation in New York or Louisiana or Seattle. If they could have half the number of cases, half the number of people coming to the hospital, you know, half the number of healthcare workers who are sick, that would make a tremendous impact. And so what we're striving for here may be a little bit different than what we might be striving for with, you know, a vaccine for a disease where we need long-term protection or, you know, where we need a 95% efficacy.
Okay. Time for just a few more questions. We will go now to Louis Jacobson of PolitiFact. Louis, we'll get you unmuted here, and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I was wondering about the differences that would make the coronavirus vaccine either more difficult or easier or just different than the attempts to make a vaccine for, say, Zika or Ebola or swine flu.
You want to comment, Wilbur?
I'm not sure exactly what. Can you restate the question? Maybe I didn't understand it correctly.
Sure. Is there something that makes coronavirus a more difficult disease to target with a vaccine compared to some of the other ones we've tried to develop recently?
Yeah, I guess I'm not of the opinion that coronavirus is more difficult than, say, an Ebola or Zika vaccine. These are all, in my opinion, very similar emerging infections or zoonotic infections that we are trying to kind of predict, you know, that we know are out in nature, and just over time, at some point, we expect that they will spill over into humans. So I actually don't feel that that this particular virus is any more difficult from the sense of making a vaccine. However, it's just the urgency is right there because it's so highly transmissible, and we're seeing so many deaths and hospitalizations due to it right now. And we're right now just seeing an upsurge that there's this huge urgency compared to Ebola in West Africa or even in Congo that we've been watching over the past few months. You know, those never really broke out and became that huge global urgency that we're seeing right now with COVID-19. I don't know if that answers your question specifically, but
sure it does.
I see as the difference.
Thank you.
So I have another a text question from Jess Burns of Oregon Public Broadcasting. My understanding is that no mRNA vaccines have made it through human testing to production in the past. Since this technology is so new, is there any additional focus in the human trials to make sure of safety?
Yeah, so I think with the prior mRNA vaccines, it hasn't been safety concerns that have limited their development. And I think Wilbur alluded to this, but unfortunately, vaccine development is a business model. And so, we could both name many good vaccines that have never gone forward, either because there's no manufacturing partner, there's no perceived market, whatever it might be. So the prior mRNA vaccines, you're absolutely right, have not been licensed, but it was not because of specific safety concerns.